August 20th, 1944. 11 a.m., a lonely road south of Brest, France. The world was reduced to the smell of ozone and wet canvas. Rain, a cold, persistent Atlantic drizzle, hammered a frantic rhythm on the steel roof of the M3 half-track. Inside, Corporal Arthur Katz, 28 years old, felt the chill deep in his bones, a dampness that his field jacket, 2 sizes too large, couldn't repel. He was a man made for steam-heated New York apartments and the velvet-draped silence of a broadcast studio, not this. Not this cold, metal box parked on a forward ridge, less than 3 miles from a very real, very awake German infantry division. He ran a slender hand over the control panel of the wire recorder. The metal was cold to the touch. This was his weapon. Not a .50 caliber machine gun, but a 500-pound custom-built sound system bolted to the truck bed. His ammunition wasn't rounds of brass and lead. It was spools of steel wire, painstakingly recorded with the sounds of war. Tonight, his target wasn't a man. It was an entire army's perception. 5 minutes, Professor. The voice crackled over the small intercom, thick with gravel and sarcasm. Sergeant Malone. Malone was the real deal, a gruff infantryman from the 82nd Airborne, assigned to babysit the talent. He was the muscle, the man with the Thompson submachine gun resting in his lap, the man who clearly thought this whole operation was a joke. You sure you don't want to play him some Glenn Miller first? Maybe they'll surrender from bad taste. Arthur ignored him, his focus absolute. He was checking the connections to the massive speaker horns mounted just behind his head, shielded by a canvas tarp. He wasn't a soldier, not really. He was a sound engineer, drafted from his high-profile job at CBS Radio in Manhattan. One day, he was mixing the acoustics for the War of the Worlds with Orson Welles, creating panic with sound effects. The next, he was in uniform, told his specialized skills were needed for something top secret. That something was the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a unit so bizarre it felt like a collective hallucination. It was an army of 100 men, but it wasn't an army of soldiers. It was an army of artists, illustrators, architects, designers, and, like Arthur, a handful of audio wizards. Their job wasn't to fight, it was to pretend. Their mission tonight was Operation Brest. They were to impersonate the entire United States 6th Armored Division, 15,000 men, hundreds of tanks, artillery, and support vehicles. They had to create a phantom army, convincing the German command that the 6th Armored was massing for a direct assault on the heavily fortified port of Brest. The real 6th Armored, meanwhile, was at this very moment racing 80 miles to the east, silent and dark, preparing to punch a hole through a weakened, unsuspecting German line. If Arthur and his team failed, if the Germans didn't buy the illusion, they would realize the eastern flank was undefended. The real 6th Armored would be met by reinforced panzer divisions. The entire breakout from Normandy could stall. You know what the GIs in the real army call you? Malone's voice crackled again, bored and mean. The Ghost Army. Not 'cause you're spooky, 'cause if the Krauts get wise and send one patrol up this hill, we're all gonna be ghosts. For real. This ain't Broadway, cats. This is a goddamn suicide mission. Malone wasn't entirely wrong. Just 400 yards away, shimmering in the thin moonlight that broke through the rain, was an entire company of M4 Sherman tanks. They were parked in a perfect textbook formation, muzzle forward, ready for battle. They were also made of rubber, inflatable. Each one weighed 90 pounds and could be brought to life by 4 men with an air compressor. Earlier that day, Arthur had watched as illustrators from the visual deception team, men who used to work for Disney or the New Yorker, walked among the rubber behemoths, artfully painting on fake mud splatters and unit insignias. From a distance of 500 yards, they were indistinguishable from the real thing. But up close, they were nothing but hot air. 2 minutes, Arthur said into his microphone, his voice calm, professional. He could feel the vibration as Malone nervously idled the half-track's engine, ready to flee. Arthur put on his heavy Bakelite headphones. He threaded the steel wire through the playback head. This was it. This was the performance. He wasn't queuing up a sound effect of a closing door. He was about to conduct a symphony of deception. He had personally recorded these sounds near St. Lo, spending 3 days in a ditch under actual mortar fire, his bulky recording equipment capturing the unique grinding roar of a Sherman tank column moving at night. He had captured the clank of treads, the high-pitched whine of the turret motors, the shouted, muffled commands of tank crews. He had edited them for weeks, mixing dozens of tracks into a single, terrifying audio masterpiece, a recording designed not just to be heard, but to be believed. 1 minute. Malone killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain. The air in the truck felt impossibly thick. Arthur could feel his own pulse in his throat. Malone was right. If a German patrol got curious, they had 1 Thompson and 2 carbines against whatever was out there in the dark. If a German artillery spotter decided to shell their noisy position, this half-track would become their shared coffin. Arthur placed his finger on the main playback switch. His mind flashed back to his last night in New York, sitting in a warm studio, watching the red on-air light glow. This was the same feeling. The silence before the show. He glanced at the glowing dial of his wristwatch. 01:15 a.m., showtime. He flicked the switch. A deep, mechanical hum thrummed through the floorboards. It was so low it was felt more than heard, a vibration that rattled the fillings in Arthur's teeth. For a heart-stopping second, he thought it was a real Panzer, its engine idling just over the ridge. Then the sound clarified, blooming from the massive speakers behind him. It was his recording. Track 1, column idling, heavy armor. Then he brought in track 2. The sound of a single Sherman tank starting cold. The grinding of the starter, the cough of the engine catching, a metallic shriek as the driver revved it too hard, and then the heavy rhythmic clank, clank, clank of its treads biting into mud. The sheer volume was terrifying. Arthur had positioned the speaker horns to use the valley as a natural amphitheater, bouncing the sound off the far hills. The noise didn't just travel to the German lines, it sounded like it was everywhere. In the driver's seat, Malone, who had been bracing for a joke, flinched. He instinctively reached for the door handle. "Jesus Christ, Katz," he hissed over the intercom, his voice tight. That sounds real. Turn it down. They'll hear us." "That's the point, Sergeant," Arthur said, his eyes never leaving the glowing VU meters. He was in his element now. This was his studio. "They're not supposed to think it's us. They're supposed to think it's the 6th Armored, and the 6th Armored isn't quiet." He was mixing the sound live. This was the genius of the 316th Sonic Deception Company. They didn't just play one recording, they performed. Arthur had 2 wire recorders, and he was crossfading between them like a DJ at a macabre nightclub. He brought in another track, a recording of a jeep convoy arriving, drivers shouting, engines whining. He layered it over the idling tanks. The illusion was one of build-up. A division doesn't just appear, it arrives. "Okay, Professor, it's loud," Malone conceded, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "But what about the other guys? This is just one truck. It sounds like it's coming from one spot." Arthur allowed himself a small, tight smile. "Give it 30 seconds, Sergeant." He checked his watch. 01:18 a.m. He picked up a different microphone, one that patched him into a secure, low-power radio frequency. "Sonic 2, this is Sonic 1. Bring in your element. Phased approach, just like we rehearsed. On my mark." Mark. A mile to their left, another M3 half-track, Sonic 2, opened up. Its speakers were aimed at a slightly different angle. Suddenly, the soundscape exploded. The column was no longer a single point of noise. It now had width. It sounded like it stretched for a mile along the road. Then, half a mile to their right, Sonic 3 came online. This one was playing a different set of recordings. The heavy thud of engineers setting up artillery, the clang of metal on metal, the rumble of heavy trucks reversing. The front line was now 3-dimensional. It was a masterpiece of acoustic engineering. Arthur wasn't just a sound guy anymore, he was a painter using sound to create a picture of a massive, terrifying army preparing for a dawn assault. He faded out the convoy-arriving track and brought in a new one. Tank maintenance. The high-pitched squeal of a rusty bolt, a muffled curse, a heavy hammer striking steel. These were the details that sold the illusion. Armies weren't just engines, they were men. "Holy hell," Malone whispered, peering through the rain-slicked slit of his armored windshield. "If I didn't know better, I'd be calling in an artillery strike on this whole valley." "That's the risk," Arthur said calmly, his hands moving over the mixer knobs. He was riding the levels, increasing the volume slightly as the rain intensified, ensuring the sound carried with the same muddy, muffled quality as a real column. This was the part of the job that manuals couldn't teach. It was instinct. It was art. He'd learned this from Orson Welles. You don't just tell the audience a Martian has landed, you play them the sound of a policeman's whistle, a panicked shout, and the slow, scraping sound of metal dragging through a city street. You let their own fear paint the picture, and the Germans were very, very afraid of the 6th Armored Division. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the night. It wasn't one of Arthur's recordings, it was a high-pitched metallic thwump, followed by a soft, ascending whistle. Malone's blood ran cold. Flare, they're sending up a flare. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. He fought the instinct to kill the power, to dive for the floor. The show must go on. An army wouldn't go silent for one flare. A magnesium white star burst into life high above the valley, casting a sickly, terrifying light. It drifted down slowly on its parachute, illuminating the entire landscape in stark black and white. It lit up the field 400 yards away, the field where the rubber tanks sat. "They'll see 'em," Malone breathed, his voice a panicked whisper. "They'll see the decoys. We're dead. We're dead, Katz." Arthur kept his hand steady on the mixer. He watched the flare drift. From 3 miles away, in the rain, in the middle of the night, would they see? Would they notice the tanks were slightly too clean? That they cast no heavy shadows? That there were no crews scrambling for cover? The flare sputtered, casting long, dancing shadows. It hissed as it fell, and then darkness. The valley was plunged back into a blackness so profound it felt solid. For a full minute, the only sound was the rain and the relentless, thundering roar of Arthur's phantom army. Then, from the German line, came the reply. Not a mortar shell, not machine gun fire. It was the distant, unmistakable sound of a German tank engine. A Panther starting up. Then another. And another. They weren't attacking. They were moving. Arthur looked at Malone, his face pale but his eyes electric. They're not attacking us, Sergeant. They're repositioning. They're moving their armor to face us. Malone stared out into the blackness, his mouth slightly open. I'll be a son of a bitch, he muttered. They're buying it. The crazy bastards are actually buying it. The performance lasted for 3 agonizing hours. Arthur Katz worked the wire recorders with the focus of a concert pianist, his hands a blur. He didn't just play the column track on a loop, he orchestrated a narrative. At 02:30 a.m., he introduced Artillery Arrival, a heavy thudding track of 105mm long tom cannons being unlimbered and dug into the earth. At 03 a.m., he simulated a refueling operation, a chaotic mix of idling tank engines, high-pressure fuel pumps, and the metallic clang of dropped jerry cans. He even threw in a 10-minute track of a mail call, complete with muffled shouting and laughter, a touch of humanizing genius he'd insisted on. An army isn't just machines, he'd argued to his skeptical superiors. An army is bored men. Boredom is the sound of occupation. Sergeant Malone, long past his initial terror, now sat in silence, a convert to this strange religion of acoustic warfare. He was no longer listening for the enemy. He was listening to the illusion, completely mesmerized. He'd fought in Sicily and Normandy, and this felt real. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. At 04 a.m., as the first hint of gray light began to poison the eastern sky, Arthur began his crescendo. He faded in the sound of all the tank engines starting at once, a deafening, ground-shaking roar that signaled a pre-dawn movement. Then he cut it. Not abruptly, but with a slow 10-minute fade, as if the entire armored column was moving away from the ridge, deeper into the valley, taking up its final attack positions just beyond the horizon. By 04:15 a.m., the valley was silent again, save for the dying rain and the distant, panicked sound of German half-tracks repositioning to meet the phantom threat. Arthur finally pulled off his sweat-drenched headphones. The silence in the truck was a physical weight. "That's the show," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "So, now what?" Malone asked. "We just pack up and leave?" "Now?" Arthur said, rubbing his eyes, which burned from staring at the glowing meters. "Now the other half of the army wakes up." He pointed through the windshield. As the weak dawn light filtered through the mist, the field of rubber tanks became visible again. And among them, men were moving. This was the Visual Deception Team, Company C. They weren't soldiers, they were artists, illustrators from Pratt Institute, set designers from Broadway, and architects. Their morning performance was just beginning. One man, who Arthur knew used to design window displays for Saks Fifth Avenue, was carefully driving a Jeep in circles around the inflatable tanks, dragging a heavy chain harrow behind him. From the air, it would look like the tracks of a heavy tank maneuvering into position. 2 other men wearing authentic military police armbands were setting up a fake traffic checkpoint on the main road, ready to angrily redirect any French civilians who got too close. The most surreal part was the tank crew. A team of 4 artists climbed onto one of the 90-pound rubber Shermans. They weren't armed. They were carrying buckets. They began to wash the tank, laughing and shouting, performing for any German spotter with a pair of binoculars. They were creating life. That's insane, Malone muttered, watching them. They're just sitting out in the open. One sniper could... That's the point, Arthur said. An army doesn't hide when it's preparing to attack. It's arrogant, it's loud, it's sloppy. Our job is to be all of those things. He unhooked another microphone. It was time for the third act. Spoof radio. He patched into a frequency monitored by German intelligence. Kilo 19er, this is Big Step 6, he said, his voice now a perfect imitation of a bored radio operator from the 6th Armored. Message follows. Breakfast is cold again. Tell the colonel to get the bean counters in line. Repeat, breakfast is cold. Over. This was the chatter that German intercept stations would analyze. It was meaningless, but it was human. In another truck, a different operator was transmitting complex coded messages using a predetermined, breakable cipher, daring the German cryptographers to decode it. The solution, of course, would be a fake set of coordinates for their impending attack. Visual, sonic, and radio. a three-ring circus of deception, and Arthur Katz was the ringmaster for the sound. This was the Ghost Army, a unit whose primary weapon was imagination. These men were armed with paintbrushes, scripts, and speakers. They had been laughed at during basic training. They couldn't march in step, their salutes were sloppy, and they spent their evenings sketching, not cleaning rifles. But out here, on the front line of the mind, they were the elite. A sudden sharp crack echoed across the valley. Malone didn't hesitate. "Sniper!" he roared, ducking so low his helmet hit the dashboard. Arthur froze, his hand still on the radio mic. The sound had come from the German side. Another crack, this one closer. A thwack of a bullet hitting a tree somewhere near the field of rubber tanks. The artists performing their tank washing show didn't dive for cover. They didn't panic, they complained. "Hey," one of them shouted, loud enough for Arthur to hear. "We're trying to work here." He picked up a clod of mud and threw it in the general direction of the German sniper as if he were an annoying neighbor. Malone stared, bewildered. "What the hell are they doing? They're gonna get killed." "No," Arthur said, a slow smile spreading across his face as he understood. "They're acting. What does a bored GI do when he's shot at? He complains. He thinks he's invincible. He's arrogant." The sniper, likely confused by this utter lack of fear and the sheer absurdity of a man throwing mud at him, went silent. "See, Sergeant," Arthur said, packing up his wire spools. "That's our armor, not steel, just pure, unadulterated nerve." Malone shook his head, a look of grudging, terrified respect in his eyes. "You're all nuts. Every last one of you is certifiably insane." "Welcome to the Ghost Army, Sergeant," Arthur replied, sealing the lid on his equipment case. "The show's over for us. Now we have to get out of here before the audience throws something heavier than roses." The artists in the field gave a final bored wave toward the German lines and began to march back toward a stand of trees, presumably for their cold breakfast. Their show was over. Now, the most dangerous phase for Arthur and Malone began, the getaway. An illusion is only effective until the magician is caught climbing out the back window. The Ghost Army's primary rule was to never be in the same place for more than 24 hours. Their secondary rule was to make their exit as invisible as their entrance was loud. "All right, Professor, get that antenna down. We're wheels up in 2 minutes," Malone said. His voice had lost its sarcastic edge. It was now clipped, professional, and urgent. He was no longer a babysitter. He was an infantry NCO in hostile territory. Arthur scrambled out of the half-track, the damp morning air hitting him like a physical slap. His legs were stiff from sitting for hours. He fumbled with the clasps on the tall, spindly radio mast they had erected for the spoof radio. The sky was a bruised, sickly gray, a color that offered no comfort and no cover. Every shadow seemed too short. He could feel 1,000 invisible eyes on his back from the ridge 3 miles away. His hands, which had been so steady on the audio mixer, now trembled as he tried to unfasten a simple bolt. "Stop shaking, Katz," Malone hissed, emerging from the driver's side, his Thompson held low and ready. "You did the hard part. Don't screw up the exit. They're listening. They're watching." "I'm a sound engineer, Sergeant, not a steeplejack," Arthur muttered, his fingers numb and clumsy on the cold, wet metal. He was acutely aware of how loud his own grunting was, how the metallic clink of the antenna mast sliding down seemed to echo across the entire valley. The phantom roar of his tanks was gone, and in its place, the silence felt accusing. This was the part of the job that terrified him most, not the performance, but the reality that followed. In the studio, after a show, you turned on the lights and went for coffee. Out here, you prayed the enemy hadn't pinpointed your broadcast. "Got it," he finally whispered, collapsing the mast. He bundled the cables, his movements frantic. "Too slow, way too slow," Malone said, scanning the tree line. "Get your gear secured, now." Arthur climbed back into the truck. He locked down the heavy wire recorders, his babies, padding them with spare blankets. To him, they were as valuable as a Norden bomb sight. They were the heart of the 316th Sonic Company. Each spool of wire was a library of carefully curated lies. He thought of the man who'd championed this, Colonel Harry L. Reeder. A man who'd walked into the Pentagon and, with a straight face, told a room full of generals that the war could be won by men with art degrees. They'd laughed, of course, just as Malone had laughed, just as the Germans would laugh if they ever found out. The 23rd was an army of men who had to prove the stupid idea worked night after night with their lives as the wager. "Secured," Arthur yelled. "Good, 'cause it sounds like the critics are writing their review," Malone said, his face grim. Arthur froze. "What?" Then he heard it. A sound his recordings had never truly captured. A sound that couldn't be faked. It wasn't the ascending whistle of a spotting flare. It was a lower, heavier, tearing sound. A sound like the sky itself was being ripped in half by a giant's canvas sheet, followed by a guttural freight train roar. "Incoming!" Malone screamed, pulling Arthur down by the collar, slamming his own helmeted head against the dashboard as he dove. The shell landed 300 yards away, precisely in the center of the field the rubber tanks had occupied. The ground jumped. A geyser of black earth, rain, and shattered tree limbs erupted into the gray sky. The shockwave hit the half-track a second later, a physical punch that rattled Arthur's skull and made the 4-ton vehicle rock on its suspension. Shrapnel, the deadly metal rain from the explosion, pinged and shrieked off their armor. "They're shelling the decoys!" Arthur yelled, his voice a high-pitched squeak. "They're shooting at the inflatables!" "They bought it!" Malone roared, a wild, terrified grin spreading across his face. He was laughing. "They bought it so hard they're wasting ammo on 90 pounds of rubber." The tearing sound came again, and again. Whoosh crack, whoosh crack. The Germans weren't just firing one gun. They were bracketing the field. An entire artillery battery was desperately trying to silence the 6th Armored Division before its attack. "That's our cue," Malone yelled, slamming the half-track into gear. The engine roared to life, a pathetic, real sound compared to the Phantom Symphony Arthur had just conducted. "But the artists!" Arthur shouted, thinking of the men who had been washing the tank. "The traffic cops, are they clear?" "They cleared out 20 minutes ago. They're not that insane." Malone jammed his foot on the accelerator. The half-track lurched, its tracks spitting mud, and plunged down the reverse slope of the ridge, away from the shelling, toward the dense forest that served as their escape route. Another shell landed, this time closer. The explosion was deafening. It was on the road they had just been on. "They're shelling our broadcast position," Malone yelled, fighting the wheel as the truck slid on the wet clay. "They must have pinpointed your noise. You really pissed 'em off, Professor." Arthur clung to the steel dash, his knuckles white. This was the heavier-than-roses he had feared. The Germans were so convinced they were executing a full-scale counter-battery fire mission on a single truck with a loudspeaker. The sound of the shells, the real shells, was visceral, horrifying. It had a weight and a malice his recordings could never capture. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated intent to kill. They crashed through the forest line, branches scraping and screeching along the half-track's sides. Malone didn't slow down. He drove with a terrifying, focused rage, plowing through the underbrush. Behind them, the valley they had just occupied was becoming a cauldron of fire and smoke. The German artillery, fully convinced, was pounding the empty, muddy field, dutifully blowing up their own illusion. Every shell they fired on that empty field was a shell they couldn't fire at the real 6th Armored Division 80 miles to the east. Arthur looked back. Through a gap in the trees, he saw a direct hit on one of the rubber Shermans. The inflatable tank didn't explode. It simply popped. It vanished in a flash of flame in a cloud of black, burning rubber. It was the most beautiful, terrifying, and absurd sight he had ever seen. "We did it," Arthur breathed, the adrenaline draining away, leaving him trembling and nauseated. It worked. Malone didn't celebrate. He just kept driving, his eyes scanning the woods ahead. "The show ain't over till we're back at base drinking their coffee," he grunted. "Shut up and hold on." They drove for 5 miles, a frantic, bone-jarring marathon through dense forest, following a route marked only by small, reflective tacks nailed to trees. Malone navigated the narrow trail with a terrifying instinct, the half-track's engine complaining in a high-pitched whine. Arthur could still hear the crump, crump, crump of the German artillery in the distance, a persistent, angry thunder. They were still pounding the empty field, still murdering his phantoms. It was the sound of success, but it felt like the soundtrack to his own funeral. "They're really committing," Arthur said, his voice quiet. He was finally unclenching his hands from the dashboard. His fingernails had left deep crescents in the painted steel. "Committing? They're married to it," Malone grunted, not taking his eyes off the path. "They're probably calling in air support for Dawn, the Luftwaffe, to fight a bunch of balloons. God, I wish I could see the reconnaissance photos." He shook his head. 3 years in this man's army, I've seen guys get medals for less, and I've seen guys get shot for screwing up way simpler jobs. You artists? You're in a league of your own." It was the first time Malone hadn't used artist or professor like it was an insult. It wasn't quite respect, but it was something close. It was the professional acknowledgement of one specialist to another, the recognition of a difficult job performed under fire. Arthur just nodded, too exhausted to reply. He thought about his studio back in New York. He had always believed in the power of sound. He'd seen Orson Welles convince a nation that Martians were landing in New Jersey with nothing but a script and a well-timed sound effect. He'd always wondered if that power could be weaponized. Now he knew. The answer was a definitive, earth-shaking yes. The forest suddenly opened into a small, bowl-shaped clearing, invisible from the air thanks to a dense canopy of ancient oaks. The rendezvous point. It was a scene of quiet, organized chaos. This was the rest of the 23rd. 2 other M3 half-tracks, Sonic 2 and Sonic 3, were already parked, their speaker horns covered in camouflage netting, their operators already methodically cleaning their wire recorders. Near the edge of the clearing, the visual deception team was hard at work. The artists. They were loading the deflated, folded-up remains of their rubber army onto 2.5-ton trucks. A tall, lanky man with paint-streaked fatigues was carefully folding a deflated Sherman, handling the rubber like it was expensive silk. This was Corporal Sully Viero, who 12 months prior had been designing the costumes for a Broadway musical. "This mud is a nightmare," Sully complained to his partner, a short, muscular man who used to be a sculptor. "It's ruining the vulcanized seams, and they're shelling so uninspired. They completely missed the command jeep, zero sense of composition." "Just fold the damn thing, Sully," the sculptor grunted, heaving a 90-pound cannon barrel onto the truck bed. This was their reality. They were the backstage crew of the war, striking the set after a successful performance. Arthur and Malone pulled their truck into the designated spot. The moment the engine died, the silence of the forest rushed in. It was a cold, damp silence, broken only by the whispers of the men and the click-clack of equipment being stowed. A young officer approached them, map case in hand. Lieutenant Deaver. An architect from Chicago, he had the sharp, angular face of a man who saw the world in lines and structural loads. He was their platoon leader. "Katz, Malone, report," Deaver said, his voice low. Arthur, on shaky legs, slid out of the truck. "Sir, sonic mission complete. We ran Program 4. Armored buildup, from 0115 to 0410. Full 3 truck spread. We established perceived column width of approximately 2 miles. We included engineer and artillery elements at 0230. Enemy response?" This was Malone's cue. The sergeant stepped forward, finally giving a salute that wasn't mocking. "Sir, the enemy took the bait, hook, line, and sinker. At 0415, just as we were fading the final track, they opened up with a spotting flare. At 0420, they initiated a full artillery barrage. At least one battery, sir. They targeted the decoys and our broadcast positions. They were still firing when we exfilled." Deaver's face remained impassioned. He simply nodded, absorbing the data. He turned to his radio operator, who was sitting on an ammo can sipping coffee. "Intercepts?" The radio man looked up, a grin on his exhausted face. "Sir, it's beautiful. German command radio is on fire. They're reporting superior armored elements massing in Sector 4. One intercept quotes a panzer commander, says he's engaging at least 2, possibly 3 U.S. armored divisions. He's screaming for reinforcements. He's terrified." Deaver finally smiled. It was a small, sharp, satisfied expression. He unfolded his map and laid it on the hood of the truck, clicking on a red-lensed flashlight. "Gentlemen, here is Brest," he said, pointing with a pencil. "And here," he tapped the ridge they had just left, "is where the Wehrmacht now believes the 6th Armored Division is having breakfast." He dragged his pencil 80 miles to the east, to a different river crossing, a different quiet sector. "And this is where the real 6th Armored began their advance 20 minutes ago. They are moving into a sector that German High Command has just stripped bare, pulling their reserve panzers to come and fight us." He looked up, his eyes meeting those of Arthur, Malone, Sully, and the other men gathered around. "The 6th is moving against almost no opposition. We did it. We held them in place. We drew their fire." A quiet, breathless cheer went up from the men. Not a roar, but a murmur of profound, exhausted relief. All their stupid ideas, the rubber tanks, the sound effects, the fake radio chatter, had just saved the lives of thousands of real soldiers. "Don't celebrate yet," Deaver said, folding the map. "Our show just bought them time. Now the real fight begins. We're not done. We move out in 30 minutes. We have another show to put on tomorrow night, 60 miles from here. We're going to pull them in another direction." The men nodded, the brief moment of celebration over. The Ghost Army never slept. As long as the real army was moving, their job was to be the distraction, the matador's cape. Arthur leaned against the side of his truck, the adrenaline finally gone, leaving a hollow, aching exhaustion. He pulled out a small toolkit and a clean rag, and by the dim light of the flashlight, began to meticulously clean the magnetic playback heads on his recorder. The show was over, but the equipment had to be ready for the next one. He was a studio man again, a technician, but as he worked, he could still hear the sound of the German shells, and for the first time he realized it wasn't the sound of his death. It was the sound of applause. The next 2 weeks were a blur of mud, gasoline, and adrenaline. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops became a phantom, a whisper that haunted the German Wehrmacht across all of France. They were a traveling roadshow from hell, moving 50, 60, sometimes 100 miles in a single night. By day, they were a column of anonymous trucks, indistinguishable from any other supply unit. But packed under their tarps was the circus, deflated tanks, 500-pound speakers, and crates of paint. By night, they were the 79th Armored Division. They were the 30th Infantry. They were whoever the Allies needed them to be. Arthur Katz's job evolved. He was no longer just a tank DJ, he was a sonic god, creating entire divisions from nothing. For an operation near the Moselle River, he had to simulate an infantry regiment digging in. For 48 hours, he played a subtle, looping track of shovels hitting rocky earth, muffled coughs, and the distant, tinny sound of a field radio. He was creating a soundscape of pure human drudgery. The Germans, hearing this, reinforced their own line, wasting thousands of man-hours preparing for an attack that would never come. But now, in mid-September, they faced their most dangerous mission. The front had stabilized near the German border. After the rapid advance across France, the Allied lines were stretched dangerously thin. There was a 4-mile gap near the town of Bettemburg, a gap that General Patton's Third Army was too overextended to fill. If a German panzer unit discovered that gap, they could pour through, cut off the entire 4th Infantry Division, and roll back the Allied advance by 100 miles. The 23rd was ordered to hold the line, all 1,100 of them. They were to plug a 4-mile gap against an expected force of 15,000 Germans. "You're joking," Malone had said, his voice flat when Lieutenant Deaver gave the briefing. He wasn't sarcastic anymore, he was pale. "You're telling us we're the front line? We're not pulling them. We're not distracting them. We are the line." "That's the order, Sergeant," Deaver said, his face a grim mask. "We will create the illusion of a full-strength infantry division digging in for a protracted fight. Visual will deploy decoys along the entire 4-mile stretch. Sonic will provide 24/7 sound. We are to make this sector seem like the most heavily defended, least appealing place on the entire Western Front. We are to be a wall of noise and rubber." For Arthur, this was a new kind of terror. This wasn't a one-night performance. This was an occupation. They parked their 3 sound trucks, including Arthur's, in a staggered line, hidden in a dense forest overlooking the gap. For the first time, they weren't alone. A real company of infantry, barely 200 men, was dug in with them, a thin screen of real bullets to protect the illusionists. Arthur's performance began. He started with the digging in tracks, but as the days wore on, he had to improvise. He added the sound of a jeep patrol that would drive up and down the line every hour, just a recording he played on a separate, smaller speaker he and Malone had risked their lives to place 200 yards forward. He added the sound of a field kitchen with clanging pots. On the 3rd night, the real test came. "Movement," Malone whispered, his body rigid, his eye pressed to a night vision scope. "Woods, 800 yards, 3 silhouettes. Kraut patrol. They're probing the line." Arthur's blood turned to ice. This wasn't a sniper. This was a patrol sent to find them. If they got close enough, they would see the rubber tanks. They would hear the sound was coming from speakers. The show would be over. "Deaver, this is Malone," the sergeant whispered into his radio. "Enemy patrol, grid 47, requesting fire from our infantry screen." The reply was static-laced and desperate. "Negative, Malone. We're pinned. We have a 2nd patrol engaging us on the left flank. We can't help you. You're on your own." Malone looked at Arthur. His face was a mask of sheer primal fear. "Cats. They're coming. They're 600 yards out, moving slow. They'll be on us in 10 minutes. Arthur looked at his console. He had recordings of tanks, trucks, and artillery. Nothing for this. This was a close-quarters fight. "On our own," Arthur repeated, his mind racing. What would a real division do? What would they do right now? They wouldn't be quiet. They wouldn't just be digging. They'd be pissed. "Sergeant," Arthur said, his voice trembling but his hands moving with sudden desperate purpose. "Get on the 50 cal. On my signal, fire a 5-second burst into the trees, high, above their heads. Don't try to hit them. Just make noise. What the hell are you... Just do it, and get ready to move. We're doing the finale." Arthur grabbed his live microphone, the one that broadcast directly to the massive speakers. He took a deep, shuddering breath. He flipped on the main broadcast switch. "Now, Sergeant," he yelled. Malone opened up with the 50 caliber machine gun. The whump, 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 whump of the heavy gun was deafening. A real, terrifying sound. The moment Malone stopped, Arthur hit the switch on a new track. It wasn't a tank. It was the sound of an entire company of M1 Garand rifles firing at will. It was chaotic, terrifying, a wall of gunfire. But it was just a recording. Then Arthur did something he had never done before. He spoke into the live microphone. His voice, amplified 1,000 times, boomed across the 4-mile gap, a sound so loud it seemed to come from God himself. He wasn't Arthur Katz, the sound engineer. He was a furious, half-awake company commander. "Light 'em up," he roared, his voice cracking with faked rage and a very real dose of terror. "All platoons, fire at will. They're in the wire. Get the mortars. I want that whole grid square turned to dust. Now." He cut the mic and immediately slammed the play button on his most violent recording. Heavy mortar barrage, outgoing. The thump-thump-thump of dozens of mortars firing, mixed with the recorded rifle fire and the real echo of Malone's 50 cal, created an ocean of overwhelming, terrifying violence. From their listening post 600 yards away, the three-man German patrol, expecting a quiet, undefended gap, had just walked into what sounded like an entire American division, fully awake and murderously angry. Malone, his eyes still glued to the scope, let out a choked laugh. They're running. They are running. They're dropping their gear. They're running back to their own lines like the devil himself is after them. Arthur Katz collapsed back into his chair, his entire body shaking so violently he could barely breathe. He had just repelled a German infantry patrol with a wire recorder and a microphone. He had become the Ghost Army.